That's always the first thing, isn't it? I don't know the way toasters are going. You may need to someday. Yeah. No, no, no. Last class is going to be the 17th. You guys have a evidence exam on the 20th, Friday the 20th. And so I lose two classes. I lose Thursday, and then I lose the 24th day of our exam. If I need to, what I will do is I will just put 17 classes that you could watch at a later time. But the whole idea is that we should be running classes while you guys are pre-major exam. So, yeah. So Tuesday the 17th is Tuesday the 17th is the last day of class before the, actually, that'll be our last live class, Tuesday the 17th. After Thanksgiving, the classes will be remote. So he's shutting down the building to students as of the end of the day on the 17th, on Tuesday the 17th. And we have two classes. I might have to do a couple of Zoom classes that'll get posted on the Twin site. And then we'll have two live Zoom classes. When I say live, I mean everyone will be remote, but you can watch them while I broadcast them. And that'll be on the Tuesday and Thursday following Thanksgiving. And our last day of class is the Thursday following Thanksgiving. So a week after Thanksgiving. Then you get a reading week. And then, you know, the final exam, this is a late one. This is the 22nd. I don't know when your evidence, some of you may have crim law. I don't know when those are.
20th, 23rd.
Yeah. Oh, one's on the 23rd?
Yeah.
So mine isn't the last exam. Mine's the next to the
Nope.
last exam.
You don't win. Yeah, you don't get the prize.
Well, I'd rather not. I'd prefer to go early myself.
I do too.
First,
So
first is early. Early is best.
is the Christmas tree up yet, or is it going up this year? I like that tree with the teddy bear, you know.
I have not seen it up. I don't know what's going to happen with that. I assume they're not having the St. Anne kids into the school, so I'm not
Right.
sure what's going to happen
Right.
with that. Okay, why don't we get going? I would actually, we'll see how well we proceed here. We actually have a chance of getting into the free exercise clause of religion.
Oh, wow.
Which means
Awesome.
that I could then finish up with the establishment clause on next Tuesday, and then we can head back to start equal protection. So remember, you know, we're at the end of the book right now. We're going to end up jumping back to equal protection, and then following equal protection is the fundamental rights stuff, and that's what we'll close out on for the semester. Okay, so we're in decent shape to get everything done without rushing at the end. That's good for a change. Okay. All right, we're talking about unprotected speech. We had at the end of Tuesday's class talked about incitement. No, you know, it's funny here. I don't know if you folks can discern this at home. I've got 2, 4, 6 students in class today. Do you hear the echo with the lack of students in the classroom? It is kind of interesting.
Yeah,
When the class
a little bit. Yeah.
When the class is full of students, it doesn't echo like it does here. Oh well. See, I miss you guys for more reasons than one. So we did the first type of unprotected speech, which is incitement of unlawful activity. And, you know, the big word that we kept stressing was imminent incitement, or I'm sorry, let me say that more precisely, incitement of imminent unlawful activity. And we saw that the Supreme Court has been, at least up until recently, fairly reluctant to call certain behavior incitement. Back in the old days, if you look at the historical cases, you would see that the Supreme Court was calling everything incitement. And then the Brandenburg case changed everything. It gave additional protection to free speech, and said it truly has to be a call for imminent unlawful activity, not an abstract teaching, or not just a general call for someday we might have to do this or whatever. Okay. Today we're going to do fighting words. The first case you have is a so-called fighting words case. More often than not, these cases today are being called true threats cases. I think social media has really expanded the whole notion of true threats. And then we'll also mention, and within the fighting words ambit is the hostile audience case. So fighting words are words that essentially cause someone to punch me in the nose. I can be arrested for saying something that invokes a violent confrontation. I've always found this ironic that the person who utters the words is the one who gets arrested rather than the one who throws the punch, essentially. But that's sort of a recognition of that. And the case that we're going to do under fighting words is really a hostile audience case. It fits within fighting words, which is the Chaplinsky case. And in a case like that, you don't have to cause a fight. You don't have to cause someone to want to hit you. It's enough to cause a violent reaction by a crowd, by an audience who's listening. Okay. The big case here or the big quote here from Schenck versus United States is by Justice Holmes, Oliver Wendell Holmes. And he says, the most stringent protection of free speech would not protect a man in falsely shouting fire in a theater in causing a panic. Okay. I think today the more likely scene, if you're in a theater, if someone shouted out active shooter, I think it would have this sort of the same reaction. What would everyone do? They'd jump up and start running and panicking, and potentially people could get hurt. So that's the kind of type of activity that we're talking about here. Now I'm going to tell you that we have this first case, Chaplinsky, where the court is willing to say that Chaplinsky engaged in fighting words or hostile audience words. And then the court has really backed off of the fighting words, true threats, hostile audience, version of unprotected speech. You'll see that even in fairly extreme circumstances, the Supreme Court has not been willing to call this type of speech fighting words. Okay. Chaplinsky took place in Rochester, New Hampshire. I have been through Rochester, New Hampshire. I haven't spent a lot of time there. I know I've got a lot of students from New Hampshire who might be familiar with New Hampshire. Rochester is north of Dover, up sort of on the eastern border of New Hampshire. I think Rochester's not far from Maine, to be honest. So Walter Chaplinsky, I don't know why it matters, but the case tells us he's a Jehovah's Witness. And I guess it does matter because, as we've mentioned already, it seems that the law is always coming down on Jehovah's Witnesses. He was using a public sidewalk as a pulpit. So it sounds to me like, how there's usually a granite stone that raises the sidewalk from the street, and the sidewalk's up a little bit higher. Chaplinsky is on the sidewalk and people are in the street down below. He's passing out pamphlets, he's giving a speech, and he starts calling organized religion a racket. A large crowd gathered, became a little bit animated. A police officer tells him to move along. I'm sorry, a town marshal, sounds like a town official, comes along and tells him to move along. He doesn't. Then a police officer comes and says, come on, you're out of here. I'm going to take you down to police headquarters. On the way down, he sees the town marshal, and Chaplinsky attacks him verbally. These are the words that are said. You are a goddamned racketeer and a damned fascist. Chaplinsky admits to all of the words except the name of the deity in the words of the court. So he says he didn't take the Lord's name in vain, but he admits saying all the rest of it. And so this, of course, is 1942, and being called a fascist in 1942 is a pretty big insult. It's during World War II. So he's charged, he's convicted. The law in New Hampshire is that it's unlawful for anyone to address any offensive or derisive or annoying word to anyone who is lawfully in the street or public place, or to call him by an offensive or derisive name. The Supreme Court upheld Chaplinsky's conviction. And what it said is some forms of expression do not convey ideas. And because they do not convey ideas, they are not protected speech. And he said fighting words, and the court said fighting words and incitement are among those types of expressions that do not convey ideas. We'll see later on that this is going to change. The court's going to talk about forms of speech that also, or that the First Amendment also protects emotive forms of speech, which really don't express ideas, express visceral reactions, but still will be protected. But at this point, the court's not willing to do this. Chaplinsky uttered fighting words, words that inflict injury or tend to incite an immediate breach of the peace. This is why they call this a hostile audience case. There's an audience, and obviously they're incensed by what Chaplinsky is saying. So the court upholds this. You know, I end here with a question. Can you think of another ground upon which the New Hampshire statute could have been challenged? Teddy?
Vagueness.
Yeah, Teddy said vagueness for those of you at home. And boy, this looks, quite a bit like the case we talked about before. Annoying conduct. The gathering of 3 or more people who annoy another is against the law. Here, offensive, derisive, or annoying word. I mean, those are pretty vague expressions. The court seems not to have considered this case under the vagueness doctrine, however. But I submit it's possible that it could have been overturned under the vagueness doctrine. We're still within fighting words. And as I've mentioned today, more often than not, you're going to see the word true threats. Your author does not use this phrase, maybe just in passing in his notes. One of the cases we're going to consider uses this phrase, the Black versus Virginia case, one of the cross-burning cases, will use this phrase. A true threat is a threatening communication. It's not protected speech. It can be prosecuted under the law. It is distinct from a threat that is made in jest or as political hyperbole. The utterer does not have to intend to carry through with the threat for it to lose its First Amendment protection. True threats are justified by one of 3 grounds. One is preventing fear in people. 2 is preventing the disruption that follows from that fear. And 3 is diminishing the likelihood that the threatened violence will occur. I think the whole notion of true threats has been exacerbated by social media. I'm old enough to remember the whole evolution of the internet. I grew up, a good part of my life was lived before the internet was around. And I noticed almost immediately, even with emails, that people considered statements made on the internet very different from statements made on the written page. Statements on the written page have a sense of permanence. They're there and they don't disappear into the Ethernet as emails do. This became even more pronounced when we got texting and obviously when we got social media as well. I think people are a lot more willing to say outrageous things now over social media and over the internet than they used to be when it was committed to a written document. And, one of the big problems of social media is cyberbullying that goes on. And, the fear is that cyberbullying often takes the form of a true threat. A fair amount of social media time is spent by people who used to be in a relationship and no longer are. And they say horrible things about each other and sometimes threaten each other. So this notion of true threats is sort of all around us these days. And certainly with, the whole notion of, it used to be our biggest fear was that the Russians were going to bomb us with a nuclear bomb. Now the biggest fear is that there's going to be a terrorist attack on American soil, essentially after 9/11. That changed everything. And so I think we take true threats a little bit more seriously than we used to, because we understand that true threats may lead to terrorist activities to some degree. But you have to walk a fine line. You still cannot apply the concept with a broad brush stroke, because then you trample First Amendment rights. The initial case dealing with true threats, and this is not in your book, but I wanted to give you some context. I'm starting to see officially released bar exam questions on true threats. That's why I'm spending this time on it, okay? So in 1969, at the height of the Vietnam War, came the case of Watts versus United States. A young man was convicted of violating a federal statute prohibiting persons from knowingly and willfully making threats to harm or kill the President of the United States. Apparently, Watts was in a crowd, thought he was pretty witty by saying, if they ever make me carry a rifle, in other words, if they ever send me to Vietnam, the first man I want to get in my sights is LBJ, the president at the time, Lyndon Baines Johnson. Watts is arrested for knowingly and willfully making threats to harm or kill the President of the United States. Apparently, when he made this statement, the people around him laughed. They thought it was pretty funny. Case ends up in the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court throws out the conviction. The court distinguishes true threats from constitutionally protected speech, recognizes that there is an uninhibited, robust, and wide open political debate. Sometimes this leads to, excessive vocabulary, so to speak. Vehement, caustic, and sometimes unpleasantly sharp attacks on the government and public officials. Considering the full context of Watts's statement, including the laughter of those listening when they heard it, the courts found that it was more of a very crude, offensive method of stating a political opposition to the president rather than a true threat, okay? So, when they're spoken sarcastically, or as a form of social commentary, they wouldn't be true threats. Or if they're a joke, they wouldn't be true threats. But if in fact this guy was really threatening to kill the President of the United States, then it could well fit within the true threat exception to protected speech. Let's take this a little bit further. RAV versus the city of St. Paul. This is a very difficult case. It's difficult because of the kind of abstract reasoning of the majority. Justice Scalia wrote this opinion, number one, and it's difficult because I think virtually all of us find cross burning to be offensive and to be a threatening form of speech. if you even consider the history of cross burning and, you know, how it was used, almost always after a cross was burned, some person of color, some person of a disfavored religion, or some other outcast was going to be beaten up or even potentially lynched, quite frankly. So awful things would often occur after cross burning. What's interesting is this is the city of St. Paul, Minnesota, not a city in the deep South where you think of the KKK, but the KKK obviously had activities in the North. As it turns out, this case does not involve KKK members. It involves several teenagers who think they were being pretty funny by emulating KKK activities. They create this crudely fashioned cross, they put it on a black family's lawn, and they burn it. They are charged under a hate crime statute, a local bias motivated criminal ordinance is what the court calls it. Whoever places on public or private property a symbol, object, appellation, characterization, or graffiti, including not limited to a burning cross or Nazi swastika, which one knows or has reasonable grounds to know arouses anger, alarm, or resentment in others on the basis of race, color, creed, religion, or gender, commits disorderly conduct and shall be guilty of a misdemeanor. Before we go into this decision, I want to reinforce again that the Supreme Court has protected some very, very offensive types of speech, okay? And obviously here we're talking about a very, very offensive type of speech. Speech that invokes an ugly history of what has occurred in the United States. So the court unanimously found the decision to be unconstitutional. It struck it down. It said that it was essentially a content-based restriction on speech and had to be justified by a compelling governmental interest. The First Amendment prevents the government from punishing speech and expressive conduct because it disapproves of the ideas expressed. Here, and this is, you know, a couple of quotes from the case that kind of convey the holding of the case. Displays containing abusive invective, no matter how vicious or severe, are permissible unless they are addressed to one of the specified disfavored topics. Those who wish to use fighting words in conjunction with other ideas to express hostility, for example, on the basis of political affiliation, union membership, or homosexuality, are not covered. The First Amendment does not permit St. Paul to impose special prohibitions on those speakers who express views on disfavored subjects. In other words, the court is saying what the problem is that this is too narrowly tailored. It only applies the fighting words exception to protected speech to race, color, creed, religion, or gender. And because of that, whoops, I'm sorry, I went to the wrong one. Only to burning crosses, Nazi swastikas, or some other symbol which, you know, arouses alarm or resentment on the basis of race, color, creed, religion, and gender. Scalia here is saying is because it also doesn't extend to political affiliation. You can have a true threat because of political affiliation, union membership, or homosexuality, that it's content-based. It's only these special subject matters, you know, race, religion, color, that type of thing, that are subject to it, so it's content-based. He said, under the ordinance, one can hold up a sign saying, for example, that all anti-Catholic bigots are misbegotten, but not that all papists are, for that would insult and provoke violence on the basis of religion, okay? St. Paul has no authority to license one side of the debate to fight freestyle. while requiring the other side to follow the Marquis of Queensberry rules. Do you guys know what the Marquis of Queensberry rules are? They were created in Great Britain, and there they're pronounced the Marquess of Queensberry. These are the original boxing rules, the rules that pertain to boxing matches. So he's saying essentially one side has to follow the rules, but the other side doesn't have to, so to speak. Okay. So this sort of sums up what we're saying. It was content-based discrimination because it didn't punish viewpoints that constituted true threats or fighting words on topics not involving race, color, creed, religion, or gender. Okay. Similar case, Virginia versus Black. This case, a very different type of holding. Again, three young men, Barry Black, Richard Elliott, and Jonathan O'Mara, were convicted of violating a Virginia statute, makes it a felony for any person with the intent of intimidating any person or group to burn a cross on the property of another, a highway, or a public place. And it further specifies that any such burning shall be prima facie evidence of an intent to intimidate a person or a group. And that's going to be the problem with this case. This is why the court is going to declare this to be unconstitutional. It says any such burning shall be a prima facie evidence of an intent to intimidate a person or a group. So the court first goes out and lays out our requirements for true threats. And it says, look, the burning of a cross seems to fit within a true threat, thus taking it out of the realm of protected speech. Here, the speaker meant to communicate a serious expression of intent to commit an act of unlawful violence to a particular individual or group of individuals, okay? The problem is, however, and once again, we threaten, if I threaten you never intending to harm you, it still can be a true threat. That is not a defense to true threats. Because remember, one of the justifications is to prevent the fear of threats. A lot of psychological trauma can follow if someone gets threatened, okay? So the court said that this is unconstitutional. And the reason it's unconstitutional is because treating the burning as prima facie evidence of intent to intimidate renders it unconstitutional. The court says this is overbroad because, now listen to this, it is overbroad in that it may cover other forms of cross burning that are not intended to intimidate, okay? So these kids, according to the court, are stuck with the intent to intimidate because there's a prima facie case. Have you guys talked about prima facie evidence in civil procedure and evidence class? Prima facie evidence is if you submit prima facie evidence, if you submit this certain evidence, then it establishes the minimum requirements to prove that cause of action, essentially. And it would essentially have to be rebutted, okay? So what the court is saying here is it puts all cross burning within the intent to intimidate, and it doesn't exclude cross burning that is not intended to intimidate, okay? I find this just mind blowing. I mean, what planet does the Supreme Court live on? Okay. What's the whole purpose of burning a cross in the United States, given the history and culture of the United States? Teddy?
I guess I'm just thinking of just trying to think of creative ways. You ever seen those cool fireworks where you actually have it lit up, or it does form a cross? They have kind of one of those special ceremonies, so it could be a fiery cross that's in a cross form that's a firework, or even like I guess a candlestick holder that's kind of in the cross form that is burning. So I guess I'm being creative, but that's about it.
Well, I think what you're doing is kind of looking at it in a vacuum, right?
Yeah.
Without considering the culture and history of what cross burning involves.
Okay.
In here, I think, you know, Clarence Thomas is right on point. Now, look, this is my opinion, and it's not a political opinion. I studied history. And so I think we all know what cross burning means. And the Justice Clarence Thomas dissent. Remember now, he was with the majority on the RAV case, but he's in the dissent in this case. He essentially tells us, you know, what I think I'm saying right now, which is all cross burning is a true threat. You know, that's given the history of the KKK and the use of crosses, the fact that crosses are burned only on the history is they're burned only on the lawns of persons of color, Jews and Catholics. That's the history of cross burning in the United States. So it means, you know, things to people who have crosses burned. So he says, in every culture, certain things acquire meaning well beyond what outsiders can comprehend. That goes for both the sacred and the profane. I believe that cross burning is paradigmatic, is the paradigmatic example of the latter. So, you know, I tend to agree with Thomas on this one. Maybe, you know, maybe the court's thinking like Teddy that they're, you know, you can do a fireworks display in the shape of a cross, and that has an entirely different meaning, for example. But whether you agree with me or disagree with me doesn't matter in this class, right? What do you have to know? The law according to the Supreme Court of the United States, and this has not been overturned. What does this tell us? The Supreme Court is going to be hard pressed. Ever since Chaplinsky, the Supreme Court has not found that something fits within fighting words. Okay. So it's even going to be hard pressed to find that cross burning is a true threat. So, you know, it's consider this one very carefully if you think it's going to be within true threats. All right, sexually oriented speech. Always a matter of concern in regard to the First Amendment. I won't get into this here. We do talk about this more in First Amendment. I will only tell you this. The word speech is given a fairly broad meaning. Speech includes all forms of expressive conduct. And I think you could perceive this from the cases we've already considered in this class. So, for example, when we did the Finley case, you know, about offensive artwork, whether it should receive grants from the government or not, based on its content. To understand that case, you had to understand the court considered artwork to be expressive conduct that falls within the realm of free speech. When I create an artistic painting or photo or portrait or drawing or whatever, or sculpture, I am often expressing an opinion. Art has been used to express opinions in the past, okay? And I think you know from, you know, the whole secondary effects doctrine that we talked about in the Playtime Theaters, Renton versus Playtime Theaters case, that nude or suggestive dancing in adult motion pictures can also be deemed to be within the free speech clause, protected by the free speech clause, okay? On the other hand, you know, some of this, especially when children are exposed to it, some of these forms of speech can be deemed harmful. And so the whole idea is, it's all a slippery slope, allegedly, but where do you draw the line? There's a big debate today among sociologists as to whether all pornography, which we're going to see as protected speech, should be banned. Some people argue that anything that objectifies women in a sexually explicit way causes violence among men, and causes other antisocial behavior, usually among men. Some sociologists and psychologists say, no, that's not the case. So there doesn't seem to be a consensus of opinion on that. And I know from, having read some papers on this, that it's a very bitter argument that's ongoing today. But the state of the law today is that mere pornography is protected speech. It can be heavily regulated, but it's protected speech, while obscenity is unprotected speech, okay? Now, it's hard to understand what obscenity is. This is the only slide you're going to have. There's no reason to go over the cases. The cases don't tell us the details of what's being examined, okay? So, so there's really no sense of seeing the cases. Justice Arthur Goldberg retired from the United States Supreme Court in the mid-1960s. He was an associate justice of the Supreme Court. This is fairly interesting. It shows you how much prejudice was involved in society. There was a seat on the Supreme Court called the Jewish chair. The first person who held the Jewish chair was Justice Brandeis. Then when he retired, it was filled with Justice Felix Frankfurter. And then when he retired, it was filled by Arthur Goldberg. LBJ attempted to fill it with another Jewish guy named Abe Fortas in the mid-1960s when Goldberg retired. But Fortas had too many ethical issues going on. And so his confirmation never went through. But in any event, when Arthur Goldberg retired, he jokingly said, the reason I retired was because I was sick and tired of being forced to go into the theater in the basement of the Supreme Court building and watch obscene film after obscene film, essentially. And just picture the image. Back then, all of the members of the Supreme Court, all eight of them were relatively old men, and all of them except for one was, all of them were Christian men. One was Catholic, William Brennan. One was Jewish, Arthur Goldberg, and all the rest were Protestants. And that's sort of the history of the Supreme Court up until recently. Now you have a much more diverse Supreme Court, in terms of religion and in terms of gender as well. Still only one African-American on the Supreme Court, but otherwise, more diverse than it used to be, okay?
I like how the Supreme
It has its own movie theater right there. They also have a basketball court in the on the top floor of the Supreme Court. So it's a fairly self-contained building. The justices work ridiculous hours, and their law clerks work ridiculously long hours. They're in that court for a long time, every single day. So I'm sure they have a lot of amenities.
They really have a basketball court? Are you serious?
Yep, they have a basketball court. In fact, Justice Justice White, who was appointed by Kennedy, played college football for the University of Colorado and played professional football and was a great athlete. He used to regularly challenge the law clerks to one-on-one games in the basketball court, and was very proud of the fact that he would usually whip their asses. And he was obviously much older than the kids that he was playing.
Any pool?
There's no pool that I know of, Karen.
Professor, can I ask you a question?
Yeah, who's this?
It's Lisa.
Oh, hi, Lisa.
Hi. So I just typing notes while we're talking, and you did say mere pornography is protected speech, but obscenities is not protected?
That's correct. Pornography is protected. We're going to call it more precisely, Lisa, protected but low value speech, which means that it's subject to regulation, more than fully protected speech, but it is protected. Obscenity is not protected at all. Okay.
Okay, and are we gonna get into any of like the social media protected speech here or no?
Well, I don't know what you mean by the social media protected
Like
speech.
when we're, when on Facebook or Twitter, or what would be free speech and what would not?
Facebook or Twitter is no different from anywhere else, Lisa.
Okay, perfect.
Okay, so if I put obscenity on Facebook, I'm going to be prosecuted. If I
Okay.
put mere pornography, you'll see by the end of the class. Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. So obviously, then the key here is distinguishing pornography from obscenity, right? And the way that we do this is we have a test for obscenity, and if it's sexual related speech, sexual content speech that does not meet the test for obscenity, then it is just pornography. Almost all pornography is protected speech. There's one exception to that, which is child pornography that we'll talk about as well. Okay. Here is the test for obscenity. It is almost unintelligible, just so you know. Okay. In fact, Potter Stewart, I'll tell you another story. I'm full of stories today, aren't I? Potter Stewart, one of the justices of the Supreme Court, wrote in one of his concurrences, I don't know the definition of obscenity, but I know it when I see it, and that is not obscenity. Okay, so he uses the sort of I know it when I see it test, so to speak, which is kind of a sad comment on how helpful this test is. But I'll give you a tip when we're done with this test as to, I think, the most important way to determine whether it's obscenity or not. First, the expression must appeal to the prurient interest in sex. Prurient is a fancy word for lewd, lascivious, or lustful. This is a pretty low standard, and an awful lot of published material applies to the prurient interest. Okay. Two, this is the big one. This is the one I'm going to explain. In my opinion, this is how you distinguish obscenity from pornography. The expression must portray sex in a patently offensive way. So it's more than just the sex act. It's more than just the graphic sex act. There has to be something additional that is just patently offensive. Like mixing it with body excrements is one of the things that they say can do that. Or just absolutely being demeaning to women or to a person or something like that. Okay. So I don't know. I haven't seen these films, but the Shades of Grey films obviously are not obscenity, right?
Yeah.
But yet they are very, very graphic from what I'm told. I think what keeps them from being obscenity is the fact that the sex is not necessarily patently offensive in them. And then finally, the expression does not have serious literary, artistic, political, or scientific value using a national standard. A national standard as opposed to a contemporary community standard. Contemporary community standards, have we learned nothing from this election cycle, but for the fact that there's two Americas right now and they think very differently and they see things very differently? Understanding that, do you think that different parts of America are going to have wildly different approaches to what should be obscenity and what should not be obscenity? In what is good literature and what is not good literature, right? And so this is a national standard. And the example I always give here is the Nabokov book Lolita, which is about a man who has an affair with I think it's a 14-year-old girl, a very, very young girl, and it's repulsive to think of this man engaging in this affair with the girl. But at the same time, it's considered to be one of the greatest works of literature of all time. If you ever look up the 100 greatest novels of all time, you'll find Lolita right up near the top there somewhere. So, you know, that's what would save it from being obscene, is the fact that it has literary, artistic, political, or scientific value. Okay, so that is it. Now, I don't want you to worry too much about this. You should learn the definition. You might get it on my short answer section of the exam. But just like your authors don't put the facts of the cases into your books, because you know the ones that find obscenity can be so offensive, the bar examiners aren't going to either, are they? And so they might ask you an abstract question about obscenity, but it's, you know, it's going to be hard for them to give you a fact pattern and ask whether it fits the definition of obscenity or not. Okay. An essay. There you go. You won't get one from me. I don't need to read that. So there's your definition of obscenity. And again, it's not really worth having you read these cases that surround it here, because they don't really give you examples of it. All the rest of it is pornography. And again, it's usually either the serious literary, artistic, political, or community scientific value, but most often the patently offensive way that separates it from mere pornography. I can't believe I'm calling it mere pornography. You know, that's almost like saying mere second-degree murder as opposed to first-degree murder, right? If it is not obscenity, it is pornography. All pornography is protected but low-value speech, with one exception. Child pornography is not protected. Even if it doesn't rise to the level of obscenity, child pornography is not protected. Okay? And New York versus Ferber tells us about this rule from 1982. A New York child pornography law prohibited persons from knowingly promoting sexual performances by children under the age of 16 by distributing material which depicts such performances. The Supreme Court here says that child pornography is unprotected speech. Reason, and again, this helps me understand this. Remember the difference of focus between obscenity and child pornography. The laws against obscenity are protecting the viewer or the reader. The laws against child pornography are protecting the child actors and actresses, okay? It's their youth that we're trying to, you know, protect in this case. And we're trying to protect them from being sexually exploited. And so, the court here doesn't just call it a compelling government objective, it calls it a compelling government objective of surpassing importance to protect children from the mental, physical, and sexual abuse associated with pornography while not violating the First Amendment. Okay? Doesn't have to reach the level of obscenity. If a child is used to portray sex, whether the child is actually having sex or whether the child is depicting sex, it falls within child pornography, okay? This case is going to distinguish this, and you're going to find here in the Ashcroft case that the court says this is not child pornography. So Congress passes the Child Pornography Prevention Act of 1996. Here's the prohibition: any visual depiction, including any photograph, film, video, picture, or computer-generated image or picture that is or appears to be, those are important words, of a minor engaging in sexually explicit conduct, and any sexually explicit image that is advertised, promoted, presented, described, or distributed in such a manner that conveys the impression, another big word, it depicts a minor engaging in sexually explicit conduct. This is challenged. The court finds this law unconstitutional because the depiction of children engaged in sex is not the focus of making child pornography unprotected speech. The whole idea is to protect the children. So if it's an adult who just looks young and is portraying a child, or if it's a CGI, a computer-generated image that's showing a child engaging in explicit sex, that does not fall within the child pornography exception to protected speech, okay? It has to be an actual minor who is either engaged in the sex act or is simulating the sex act, okay? And again, the reason here why simulation is enough is because the goal is to protect children, not just from the physical abuse of sex, but also the mental abuse of even simulating the sex act, okay? All right. Here's our child pornography wrap up. This sounds like a recap after a sporting event. I don't mean it to come off like that. Even if the expression is not deemed obscenity, if it's mere pornography, ask the question, but is it child pornography? It's child pornography if it depicts an actual child involved in the sex act, whether the depiction is actual or simulated. The purpose is to safeguard the physical and psychological well-being of minors. You don't have to find that it's obscenity. It's a lower standard than obscenity merely because of the fact that it involves children and we're trying to protect children, okay? Okay, protected but low value sexual speech. In other words, pornography, okay? Again, the definition of pornography for us is sexual content that doesn't rise to the level of obscenity. We call it low value because even though it's protected, it is still subject to general regulations by government, okay? And we've already talked about this to some degree in zoning laws. Towns can zone in terms of time, place, and manner restrictions on pornography. And here's our case of Young versus American Mini Theaters, another buffer zone case in Detroit, 1,000 feet from other buildings with so-called regulated uses, 500 feet from residential districts. This keeps them, like the other case we looked at, keeps them away from schools, churches, playgrounds, and the like. They sue, and the court said that this is okay. You can regulate where pornography is aired, so to speak, or shown. Not a content-based restriction, merely a limitation of where it may be shown. And this case came before the secondary effects case we already talked about, but this is sort of a secondary effects case as well. The City of Erie versus Pabst AM. Now, remember I told you that with zoning laws, a town has to allow adult entertainment somewhere in the town, okay? So if it's a bookstore, if it's a movie theater, there has to be a place where it's allowed. It can't be totally banned. There's one exception to this, and the exception is nude dancing. This case is about nude dancing. The City of Erie had a law that prohibited anyone from knowingly or intentionally appearing in public in a state of nudity. They at least had to wear pasties or G-strings. The ordinance effectively banned all nude dancing in the city. Pabst sued, and once again, we have the secondary effects argument. Justice O'Connor wrote this decision. This is content neutral because it's not motivated at banning the expression. It is motivated at banning the secondary effects of the expression. And I don't have to really go into that. And it's not here. The problem I have with this is an outright ban. Just after we learned that you can't have an outright ban, the Supreme Court seems to have used the secondary effects doctrine to say you can when it's nude dancing. It seems to be limited to this. Okay, now we get to swear. Indecent speech. Generally, profane, indecent speech is protected as long as it's not obscenity or child pornography, okay? I've given you a couple of examples. I list one of them there. Some very offensive speech is indeed protected speech. There are two areas of exceptions. Chemerinsky doesn't spend a lot of time on the first one, unfortunately. Public schools, up until high school, public schools can prohibit profane and indecent language while involved in a school activity or while on campus, okay? So this fuck the draft jacket, while it can be worn for an adult in a public place, as was the case in the Cohen case, which we'll look at fairly soon, okay? It can't be worn, well, let me rephrase this. If it's worn to school and a child in the school wants to punish the child for wearing it, the school is free to punish the child for wearing it, okay? And actually, I'm using the word child. Some high school seniors are 18 years old. So even non-children as well. But it has to be on the school campus or at a school event. So obviously, if a senior in high school wears a fuck the draft jacket off campus while not engaged in a school event, then that person is engaging in protected speech. So stated another way, kids in school don't have free speech rights. Now the court has justified this by saying schools are not just responsible for educating the kids on the 3 R's, reading, writing, and arithmetic. They're also responsible for inculcating civilized discourse in the youth, or shaping and forming the youth to be civilized members of society, so to speak. One of the most, this case hit the news. It's the Moore case, M-O-O-R-E. We're not going to cover it. There was a school event. It was off campus. It was a fundraising event. And they were trying to get people to donate money to a charitable cause. So one kid had the great idea of putting up a big sign to attract people over and then talking them into donating money. And the big sign that he put up in this public park was "Bong hits for Jesus." And he was suspended from school because he did that during a school-related activity, and the Supreme Court upheld the suspension, saying exactly what we've said. You don't have your free speech rights on campus or during school events. I think "Bong hits for Jesus" is a much more peaceful notion than this one right here that I've just highlighted, right? But there you go. I wonder if they would do it now in a state like Massachusetts, where marijuana well, if you were a minor, that wouldn't have been the case, but you can smoke pot in Massachusetts if you're an adult, right? In certain circumstances. I don't think you can do it in public, but in certain circumstances. The second one, and this is the one we'll spend a little bit more time on here, is broadcast media. Now, you guys are too young to know what broadcast media is. People of a certain age only were exposed to broadcast media. Broadcast media is where a television signal or a radio signal, you guys know radios, a radio signal is literally broadcast. The waves travel through the atmosphere and are received by a radio or a television set. And of course, I grew up with television that had antenna and that received these broadcast signals, and we only had 3 or 4 stations. And radio used to be a much bigger deal than it is now. Now we live in the days of a Sirius and XM radio, where you have satellite signals. Okay, so when I refer to broadcast media, I'm referring to old-fashioned television. And some people, by the way, who live close enough to these transmitters still receive broadcast signals for their televisions, and they are broadcast in high definition, or at least a lot of them are. Okay, it's one way to save on cable prices. I remember when I first heard about cable, I said, "Who the hell would pay to watch TV?" You know, the notion. I mean, at the same time, I remember saying, "Who the hell would pay for a bottle of water? Just go to the tap and you turn it on." And yet, you know, you see people doing that all the time. So when I'm talking about broadcast media, I am not talking about two big things. I'm not talking about cable television, and I am not talking about the internet. Okay. And the reason for this broadcast media exception, well, I guess we'll have to get that in a moment. First, we have the Cohen case. This Federal Communications Commission versus Pacifica Foundation is the reason why you can regulate broadcast media, but you can't regulate cable TV or the internet. We'll see why in just a minute. Okay. So here's our first example of offensive speech, indecent offensive speech that is protected. Cohen versus California, 1971, at the height of the Vietnam War. A 19-year-old department store worker named Paul Robert Cohen in California walked into a courthouse, and on the back of his jacket was emblazoned, "Fuck the draft, stop the war." He was charged for violating this California statute that prohibits maliciously and willfully disturbing the peace and quiet of any neighborhood or person by offensive conduct. He was actually given a 30-day jail sentence. The case goes up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court overrules it. And this is our notion. You know, Voltaire is supposed to have said, "I may despise all that you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it." Okay, and that's sort of this notion here, is that if we're not going to protect offensive conduct, then we really don't have a First Amendment. Just because we don't like what you're saying doesn't mean that we should be able to regulate it or ban it. If the government doesn't like what you're saying. The court says, while this is provocative, it was not directed towards anyone, so it wasn't fighting words. There was no evidence that people in substantial numbers would be provoked into some type of physical action by the words. So it's not fighting words because of a hostile audience situation. Justice Harlan writes the majority opinion and says, this is true. One man's vulgarity is another's lyric. The court recognized now, you know, and again, they didn't quite recognize this back in the Chaplinsky case, did they? But what they're saying is the First Amendment protects two elements of speech. You know, previously it was just the cognitive element, the expression of ideas. And that's why fighting words and obscenity are not protected speech, because they're deemed not ideas. But now the court is saying we protect the emotive element of speech as well. Speech that creates a visceral reaction of some type can be protected speech, okay? So this case, as much as any, says that the First Amendment protects even offensive expression. And again, keep that in mind when you're thinking of the cross-burning cases and some of the other cases, some of the vile things that people say, and it's still protected speech. Now, back to our broadcast media exception. Federal Communications Commission versus Pacifica Foundation. I don't know, do people still listen to George Carlin? He's now dead.
Yeah, I still listen to him.
He was a big deal in my generation. He was not just a comedian, but a real social satirist as well. And one of his skits, one of his routines, was the 7 words you can't say on television or radio. And if you hear it, I mean, you can tell he practiced them a lot because they come off his tongue so quickly and so easily. You know, it's kind of like those of you who have had me for first year property, not many of you have. It's kind of like, what are the 5 powers of the fee simple? Use, abuse, exclusive possession, reap the fruits, convey in 2 ways, right? Well, George Carlin does that just with all these offensive words, and I've listed them here. I'm not going to say them. One of these words you will never hear pass my lips. I just, to this day, I know I'm old, but I just find it just incredibly offensive.
Which
and-
number? Which
And
number?
I'm known for a salty tongue, but some of these are
Number 5?
some of these are you kidding me? That's not that bad a word. And then some of them are, oh my God, that's a bad word. You
Number
know?
4.
Yeah, no,
So
Colin, you always say.
Number 4 or 5?
Gotta be
So-
4.
4 or
so
5? 4 or
Yeah,
5,
okay.
Professor.
all right, no more speculating about Malaguti's vocabulary, okay? So
All together, class. Shit, it, fuck.
uh,
It's still not-
all right, let's move away from this slide. So there's a man and his son driving in a car. And at 5 o'clock, there's they're listening to a popular rock station. You know, I did the same thing with my kids driving around in a car. My kids grew up on classic rock. They like country music now for some reason, but they grew up on classic rock because that's what we listen to. So this guy's driving with his son. They're listening to classic rock, and it's the 5 o'clock comedy hour. And all of a sudden, George Carlin comes on, and the father says, "Hey, son, this is George Carlin. He's really funny. Let's listen to this." And all of a sudden, George Carlin comes out with the 7 words you can't say, and they weren't censored. They weren't, you know, bleeped out or whatever. And the father is outraged by it and complains to the Federal Communications Commission. And the Federal Communications Commission levies a fine on Pacifica Communications, Pacifica Foundation, which owned the radio station. Now, by way of a little background, I'm gonna sort of explain to you the reasoning of the court here, and it's best explained by a radio broadcast from the 1930s by a guy named Orson Welles called The War of the Worlds. Every Sunday night, the Mercury Theater would put on these dramatic sort of plays over the radio, and they had special effects, and they were, you know, were pretty well done. And this is back before the era of television, so people literally would watch the radio. Everyone would gather in the living room in front of the radio, and they would like look at the radio and listen to the play. And War of the Worlds was a depiction of the H.G. Wells novel from the late 1800s called War of the Worlds, which involved an alien, a Martian invasion of the Earth, in which the aliens were just killing people left and right, and they had all these ray guns and all these crazy things. Orson Welles, not to be confused with H.G. Wells, took it and modernized it, put it in the New Jersey countryside, and essentially depicted a news reporter who was reporting on the aliens invading. And it was an hour-long presentation, and 3 or 4 times during it, a voice would come in and say, "This is a, this is not a real event. This is a depiction of H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds," and then he'd go away. But still, people would turn on the radio partway through it, not hear the disclaimer. And apparently, a significant number of people believed that there was a real alien invasion going on in New Jersey, and that this was a real news reporter who was standing there watching things and reporting on it. And the whole notion is that with broadcast media, You come into it, you come out of it fairly, arbitrarily, right? You don't always start on time and hear the disclaimers on time. And so the whole idea here is you can't control people from hearing content that they shouldn't hear. Most specifically, you can't control kids from turning on the radio or turning on the television and then all of a sudden seeing something. I mean, you guys know that on television, for example, these are more modern examples. You guys know about the wardrobe failure during the Super Bowl game with Janet Jackson, right? That was one. Apparently, Bono during the Grammys dropped an F-bomb and they didn't censor it. And what's Lionel Richie's daughter's name? Nicole Richie on some other show dropped an F-bomb as well. Those were broadcast over like the networks, ABC, NBC, CBS. Those are broadcast networks. What this case stands for is the proposition that if it's broadcast radio, it can't be controlled. And because of that, if someone puts something offensive on, that they can be, the FCC can fine them as long as the fine is reasonable, okay? Can impose a reasonable fine on offensive language that is put on broadcast media, all right? Reno limits this holding to broadcast media. In Reno, the Federal Communications Decency Act was intended to prevent minors from unsuitable internet material. The act criminalized international transmission of obscene or indecent messages, as well as the transmission of information which depicts or describes sexual or excretory activities or organs in a manner deemed offensive by community standards. The law applied to internet transmissions as well as over-the-air broadcasts. The Supreme Court overrules this. It says it does not meet the Pacifica standard. I have to subscribe to get onto the internet, right? So I can control that to some degree with kids in my house. And the same is obviously true with cable television. I can even go one step further with cable television. You can put in a code to block certain shows that your kids can't watch. So this Pacifica standard only applies to broadcast media. It does not apply outside of broadcast media, okay? Commercial speech. In First Amendment, we spend a whole lot of time on commercial speech. It's a whole bunch of cases on commercial speech. We're not going to spend a whole bunch of time on commercial speech here. I want to introduce you to this. It used to be that commercial speech, what do you think about when you think about commercial speech? Advertising is the big one, right? Advertising is the big one. When it comes to commercial speech, it used to be that commercial speech would have been that sixth category of unprotected speech. Commercial speech used to be deemed unprotected speech. Now it is deemed protected speech, but it has this sort of weird rule, weird set of rules that applies to it, okay? So again, if you notice, it's in the protected but low value speech category, kind of like indecency and in swear words, right? It's here as well. So the big case for you is Central Hudson Gas and Electric Corp versus Public Service Commission. It says this: number one, for commercial speech to merit protection, it must concern lawful activity and not be misleading. So if commercial speech promotes unlawful activity and is misleading, it's not protected. Two, you must consider whether the governmental interest is substantial. Three, consider whether the regulation directly advances the governmental interest asserted. Four, inquire whether the regulation is more extensive than is necessary to serve that interest, okay? Now, I have done something for you. I have created a little chart for you that you can use in figuring out whether commercial speech is protected or unprotected. So if it's an advertisement for illegal activity, let's say it's an advertisement in Massachusetts for a store that sells fireworks. Unprotected speech, would you all agree with me? But not necessarily unprotected in New Hampshire, would it be? Okay. If it involves false or deceptive advertising, unprotected speech, the government may freely regulate. So I'm trying to think, perhaps someone advertising, Pillow Man there, the guy who does the My Pillow. I forget what his name is. Well, apparently some herb he said was the cure for COVID. And he was actually advertising it. I guess he's a businessman who does other than pillows. And he was advertising, and I forget what it was, turmeric, or I forget, coriander, I don't know what it was. But some herb that he put into pill form, and he said he was selling it, claiming that it was a cure for COVID, or prevented you from getting COVID, or cured you once you did. I don't remember which. That would be false or deceptive advertising. He didn't do the scientific work to determine that that was in fact the case. Then, as it turns out, apparently he gets sued all the time for this type of thing, just so you know. And I thought he was a nice guy, to be honest, in his on his My Pillow ads. He seems like a nice guy. Never trust the ones who seem nice, right? They're usually the culprits.
I
You know
think
what's
he
got my-
spent some time in jail, Professor.
Did he really? Yeah. Okay. My wife and I have this have this sort of not an agreement, but understanding between us. If you see a couple in public who are like disgustingly all over each other, they're headed for divorce. Like it's almost always the case. It's like they have to put on that show in public to hide something. That's there. The ones that argue all the time stay together forever. Number 3, true advertising that inherently risks becoming false or deceptive. This merits some protection, but is subject to governmental regulation. Something that would fall within here would be attorney advertising. When you read the cases, you'll see, for example, attorneys, a lot of states have blackout periods. After there's been an accident, an attorney cannot visit the family and try to solicit the business for 30 days. Obviously, because that could turn into false or deceptive advertising. You get, a family that's under stress and sort of has this guard down type thing. So you can't prohibit it totally, but you can put regulations on it, okay? If it runs the risk of becoming false or deceptive, okay? And then finally, the ones that the government doesn't like, laws that limit commercial advertising to achieve other goals, such as enhancing the image of lawyers or decreasing the consumption of alcohol or tobacco. One of the big ones here is some states used to ban, prohibit beer companies from putting the alcoholic content on the label of the beer can or beer bottle. And the reason for that was they were afraid that people would be looking for the highest alcohol beer going, okay? And the government didn't like that. The basic idea is whenever you have a law that says people shouldn't know certain information, it's usually a bad law. Let the people know the information and make their own decisions. And I don't know about you, but I like to have a beer with my lunch now and then. And sometimes when we're traveling, if I have a beer with my lunch and I know I have to get back in the car and travel somewhere, of course I don't go to restaurants anymore, so this hasn't happened for a while. But I'll actually, I like it when you look at the craft beer menu and it tells you what the alcoholic content is. I'm not going to get that double IPA that will have an 11 or 12% alcoholic content, right? I'm going to get the lower alcohol one. So it's kind of nice to know the alcoholic content when you're in some circumstances, okay? What's that? Oh, I drink them all, Teddy. Look at me. There isn't much in the form of calories that doesn't pass through my lips, buddy. Okay, so this is your Central Hudson case. Very briefly, just to get through the facts of the case. Public Service Commission of New York prohibits the advertising that promotes electricity use. 1980, this comes right after our first energy crisis that we had, that in many ways led to Jimmy Carter being a one-term president, Ronald Reagan beating him. A lot of Americans didn't like it that Jimmy Carter turned the temperature down in the White House and sat around and did a television broadcast from the Oval Office while he's wearing kind of a Mr. Rogers sweater, and is telling everyone to conserve, and these are hard times. So obviously, energy conservation was a big deal. So Public Service Commission says these utilities should not be advertising, hey, turn on your lights, you know, hey, burn some fossil fuels. Because at the time it was believed there was only so much energy left. It was a time when we were almost entirely dependent on foreign nations for our energy, quite frankly, and we're not anymore. And so, a laudable goal, prevent people from polluting the atmosphere and from burning expensive and valuable energy. This gets challenged. A case ends up in the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court writes the Central Hudson test case that we just looked, the Central Hudson test that we just looked at back here on slide 53. That's where that comes from, okay? And here it says that this one is unconstitutional. It violates the right to commercial speech, okay? This will be our last topic of the day. I don't think we're gonna have time to get into religion today. When I grew up, there were two things you never talked about, religion and politics. I think social media has let the horse out of that barn, don't you think? And I don't think the horse is going back in at these anymore. What places are available for speech? This is sort of a big deal. So what we're talking about here is when the government owns property, should people be able to come on the government property and speak? Obviously, when I own property, I don't have to allow you to come on my private property and speak, right? So then the question becomes, should the government allow you to be able to come on its property and speak? A little different from private property, because after all, I'm paying taxes to the government. In a way, I own a share of that property. Shouldn't I be allowed to be able to come on and speak? So what the government has done here is it understands there's different types of government property. Some of this government property historically and traditionally have been places where people come to protest and speak. So it's going to protect your right to speak in those places. Those places include public parks. Did anyone see the news last night? There were people on the Boston Common who were protesting not counting votes, right? They wanted votes counted, so they're out there protesting for it. There's been a lot of, all the way back, Boston Common was there back before the Revolutionary War. There have been protests on the Boston Common for several hundred years now in the United States. Sidewalks are another place where historically and traditionally people have been allowed to congregate and exchange ideas and engage in free speech, okay? But on the other hand, should I be able to come into the back offices of the town clerk's office and be able to hold a protest there while people are trying to work? That's a place that's generally not open to the public, right? And so you can see obviously then that the government has to look at the type of property that we're talking about and what level of speech should be allowed under those circumstances. So what the Supreme Court has done, it is that it has created three different types of property. The first is public forum property. This is, by the way, sometimes called a traditional public forum, okay? In fact, I'm going to make that change right now. Traditional public forum or public forum property. The second is called a limited public forum or a designated public forum. And the third is called a non-public forum. Obviously, you're going to have the most free speech rights on the traditional public forum, a different type of free speech rights on the limited public forum, and no free speech rights on the non-public forum, okay? So let's go through and distinguish public forum. Historically and customarily, where people are allowed to congregate and exchange ideas. Sidewalks and parks are the two big things here. Places which by long tradition or by government fiat have been devoted to assembly and debate. The rights of the state to limit expressive activity are sharply circumscribed. And here's your standard for review. It's a strict scrutiny standard for review. When a speaker is upon public forum property, the government cannot restrict speech on the basis of viewpoint, and other restrictions are subject to strict scrutiny. It cannot restrict such speech unless it can offer a compelling governmental interest, and the restrictions are narrowly tailored to meet the needs of that interest. Here's an example of this, the police department of City of Chicago versus Mosley. Every day, a man here, Mr. Mosley, walks around the perimeter of a school building on the sidewalk, holding up a sign that says Jones High School practices Black discrimination. Jones High School has a Black quota. He was peaceful, he was orderly, he was respectful, he just walked around holding his sign. He was prohibited from doing so, and the court says, no, you can't ban him from protesting in this way. Sidewalks are traditional public forums, giving labor picketing an exemption in a content-based discrimination. Government is prohibited from granting access to granting or denying access to a forum merely because of the message is what I should be saying there, okay? How many professors do you have who argue who edit their material right in class? Okay. A good professor should be able to admit when he makes a mistake. It happens very rarely with me. Limited public forum. Here's what I want you to think of here. A couple of examples. Number one, think of the high school auditorium. If the dear Lord willing, the pandemic is over, you folks will be graduating at the Collins Center, which is attached to Andover High School. It's a big theater with a whole bunch of seats in it. It's an auditorium, essentially, okay? It's owned by the town and the town rents it out, okay? That's what will be called a limited public forum. Think of another example. If you drive around in your town on a Sunday, you will often see one of the elementary schools or high schools that has been rented out to some church organization to conduct religious services in the school. Okay, so limited public forums are government property, which although not traditionally places where people congregate to exchange ideas, have been set aside for those purposes. Courthouses, schools, municipal auditoriums, okay? Now, the whole thing here is this, is if you open it for some groups, you gotta open it for all groups, understand? You can't say you can do it because you're not talking about religion. You can't do it because you're talking about religion. Here's our standard of review. The government does not have to keep limited public forums. Boy, I'm really messing up this one. Whoops. Open to public speech is kind of hard to type with your hand so high. But while they're open, the government cannot restrict speech on the basis of viewpoint, and other restrictions are subject to strict scrutiny, okay? So it's still strict scrutiny while they're open. The government has the right to shut it down to everyone, but it can't leave it open to some and not open to others. This is a real case. New York law authorizes school boards to permit after-hours use of school property for 10 specified purposes. Not one of the purposes is a religious one. a church, an evangelical church, asked to rent one of the school facilities. Wanted to show a religious-oriented film series on family values, and the school district said no. New York law doesn't allow us to do this. The law is challenged. This is a limited public forum. Again, it's not a park, it's not a sidewalk, it's not a place that historically and traditionally is used to exchange ideas, but it's a place that sometimes the government allows people to enter and then to exchange ideas, okay? So here, because it discriminates on the basis of the content of the speech, this is religious speech, this gets deemed unconstitutional, okay? And then finally, a non-public forum, that's property that are not traditional public forums, not limited public forums, are usually places where the public doesn't go. The standard here is must be a reasonable restriction and may not discriminate based on the speaker's viewpoints, much lower standard. The big case is Perry Education Association versus Perry Local Educators Association. I call this the dueling teachers unions case. You guys understand that when there's a union, there'll be negotiations to create a so-called collective bargaining agreement. And the collective bargaining agreement governs the relationship between the employer and the employees who are members of the union. Sometimes they're done with public entities like school districts. And so this town of Perry Township, Indiana, had entered into a collective bargaining agreement with the Board of Education of Perry Township, which of course is a teachers union, essentially. A rival teachers union comes along, the Perry Local Educators Association. They want to sort of suck off members from the original teachers union. And so they come to the school and they say, we want to put flyers, literature in the teachers' mailboxes, okay? And the school district says, no, you can't. They sue. They claim their free speech rights are being violated, and the court says, no, this is not a public forum, a traditional public forum, nor is it a limited public forum. This is a non-public forum. The school system is not used for the public to interchange ideas. You can't get there. I probably mentioned to you before, I was once the president of the Andover Little League. I can tell you that no schools in Andover will let any youth sports organizations distribute literature through the schools. We don't have the right to insist on that because it's a non-public forum, okay? The idea is if you do it for some, you have to do it for all, okay? We've talked about time, place, and manner restrictions. I'm going to mention one case to you, and then I promise you we will be done. This is our last case. Remember that a time, place, and manner restriction is a content neutral restriction. It does not regulate the viewpoint. Here's our test. This is the second time we've looked for the test, so I'm just re-emphasizing it again on slide 69. A time, place, and manner restriction is constitutional if it is justified without regard to the content of the speech, serves a significant governmental interest, leaves open ample channels for communications. This is a good case to describe it. McCullen versus Coakley. We've talked about this case before. This is the Massachusetts buffer zone case. Massachusetts used to have a 17-foot buffer zone around the entrance of health clinics. Now it extended it to 35 feet and was aimed at preventing disturbances in front of abortion clinics. By extending it to 35 feet from the entire building, it used to be just the entrance. Now it's the entire building, the exits and driveways. Had the effect of essentially driving protesters across the street and then sometimes onto private property where they obviously couldn't go, okay? Case comes up before the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court says this is a content neutral regulation. because it doesn't prohibit the protesters from engaging in pro-life speech. It says where they can engage in that speech, and it leaves open ample channels of communication. The court still found this case to be unconstitutional because it was not sufficiently narrowly tailored to serve the significant governmental interest. The court found that rather than having this sort of absolute standard, it could have merely prohibited aggressive protesting or taken other less drastic steps in order to maintain the public peace. Okay. We're done with speech on Tuesday. We will do, I can promise you, we'll be done with the entirety of religion by Tuesday. By Thursday, maybe even late Tuesday, we'll be heading back to the Equal Protection Clause, okay? And as I've mentioned, we're in good shape for finishing up this semester. Even with us losing a couple of classes, we've been going at a pretty good pace this semester.
Can I ask you a quick, can I ask you
Go
a quick
ahead.
question? Aside from looking at your old exams, would you say a good way to review is also to go over the quizzes as well?
Absolutely,
Okay,
absolutely go over the quizzes, review the slides. And the student study guide is there. And the methodologies are very important. The methodologies are essentially outlines of the student study guides.
yeah, no, I was looking at time management, like if you were saying you have a certain, like the quizzes are a good way, okay, good. Like what you've tested, you will retest, it's not like those are separate, those will help to review, yeah, okay,
Test it all, Karen.
good,
I
thank you.
don't demand much. I only demand one thing. I want it all.
That's all.
Okay?
Yeah, thank you.
Have a good weekend, folks. Stay safe.
Bye. You too.